as we develop our intellectual capacity and our ability to think abstractly and to venture into different realms of consciousness, it's awakening different parts of us. And one of the things that's awakening is the heart. Focus on beauty, really appreciating the beautiful and looking for the beautiful. Taking any situation or any object and just focusing on what's beautiful about it. Because beauty and our sense of beauty is heart-centered. That's not abstract, it's not intellectual, it's totally heart. So by appreciating the beautiful, that opens up the heart. And then that expands your consciousness in ways that helps you to be more patient with people who are so encased in this new direction that they can't see anything else. That could help you be a little more patient with them. Doesn't mean you have to do what they say to do, but it gives you just a little bit more empathy towards what they're going through. The heart is starting to open, and you hear it in terms of, well, the feminine is on the rise, like we're moving into a new consciousness that is more feminine in nature. That we can't do anything about that because we have set the stage, and plus there are cosmological forces in a spiritual context that are opening us up. And as the heart opens, then that's throwing us into new territory. So we can't just categorically condemn social constructs, because so often those constructs arise organically. So just to touch on this thing about faking it until you make it, in this, we categorize 3 stages in spiritual growth. One is assumption, one is comprehension, and then realization. So assumption is where we assume a role, just like an actor does in a play. You take on the role. You've heard how actors will study their character and invent a backstory, stuff that they will never use, but they go into the childhood of the character and the different relationships they had, and what those relationships did to form their character. This is what real actors do. They really understand their character, and they will practice being that person in their everyday life just to get to know that character. So that's assuming a role. And you have to do that. If your heart's desire is to be on the spiritual path, you kind of have to assume the role of a spiritual aspirant. You have to consider yourself like a New Age monk or something, and the way you do that then is you normally start accumulating sacred objects and books that are elevated nature, and you display your books. You maybe make up a little shrine, or you have a special corner where you assume it. You take that on, you construct it. You're in terms of what we're talking about, you fake it until you start to get a feeling for it. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a necessary stage. But as you do that, then you start to experience it. You start to make the connection. You're already opening up in the heart, but then when you produce on the outside these props and activities that fit an idea of it, then you start to make the connections. Oh, this is real. If I set up an altar in my house and put a nice clean cloth on it and a beautiful candle and a picture, that you begin to, that's kind of faking it until you make it. That's assuming the role of a spiritual aspirant. But then all of a sudden it clicks, like, oh my God, this is a focal point of spiritual power. I'm creating it, but I'm not creating it. I'm opening a door so that reality can then manifest on the physical plane. So then you begin to comprehend what you're assuming. So you've got the feeling and the assuming, and then you get the mental, which is the comprehension, and then those two come together and you become it. Then you're not faking it anymore. You've actually transformed into a spiritual aspirant.
And you talked about forgiveness as being a higher vibration experience, I think, something to that. You have to vibrate higher. And I look at it, and I think Steve is familiar with this. Teal Swan's teaching as to forgive, you really have to get to another level of consciousness. From your perspective, in terms of forgiveness and vibration, and what occurred to me at the time of your speaking about it was to ask, and then I've been playing with it in my direct experience. Do you
want to get my booklet?
What comes first, chicken or the egg? Do you vibrate higher? Oh, and now I can forgive? Or, okay, I'll forgive, and now I'm at a higher vibration? How do you,
Yeah.
what do y'all think? Want to start there?
Sure.
And
Sure.
and please, if you can, clarify what's meant by higher vibration.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, that would be a good place to start. So higher vibration, the example I always use is like the keyboard of a piano, because that's the easiest, right? You start with middle C, and if you go to the left and you hit the other C keys, they reduce in frequency by 1 octave, right? And these are measurable frequencies. I think middle C is like 256 or something like that, if I remember right, beats per second frequency. And then if you move to the right, then you go up in frequency. So we're talking about literal frequencies, literal vibration. However, they are vibratory ranges different from the spectrum that we're used to. So the way that it manifests is if you close your eyes and you go within, it short circuits the brain, for one thing. The brain is geared and tuned to this physical realm that we're in. And it has its own range of vibration, you know, ranging from infrared to ultraviolet. And that's just in the visual spectrum, right? But when we go within and we seek a different reality, say like when you use your imagination, I think that is a higher frequency than registering sensory input. So if we go into our imagination, we're automatically in a higher spectrum, in higher, literally meaning a higher frequency, because the brain, there's nothing to indicate that the brain is can only detect the visual range or the auditory range of the spectrum, that there are other spectrums that we have access to. And we know this through experience, but whether it's purely imaginary is something else. So we have to look at it somewhat as speculation other than what we experience. So we look at our experience of this realm of reality that we're in, and it's a subjective experience. So we're not really certain that it is quote unquote real, right? We have a consensus that it is real, because we have multiple points of reference that we both can lock onto. But there's a lot to suggest that what you see and what I see varies in many ways. So that's the subjective objective argument in terms of consciousness, you know, very rough sketch of it. So when we're talking about higher rates of vibration, it can occur in different ways. It's like, I remember having the revelation of a way to appreciate art that I didn't have before someone told me there was a portrait from 1600. It was a print, you know, on the wall. And it was a picture, I think, of Jesus. And he had a particular expression. And I had just taken it as like an image, you know, without any depth of meaning to it. But the person who was there said, you know, I wonder what he's thinking. And it bumped up what I could say in vibration. It raised my perception in vibration so that now I was in a different dimension of interpretation, because I was having to imagine what the figure in the painting was thinking, what he was feeling, what was going on inside him. So that put me in a whole different area, like a different dimension. And that had the feeling of being a rise in vibration. So this is what we're talking about, Steve, when we say to raise your vibration is to expand into other areas of perception.
Would you say that, because, I've heard this for 40 years or more, but I never really questioned anybody what did they mean by it. And it's not something that it's not an expression that I commonly use. So are you, in your understanding, does it correlate with greater and greater levels of subtlety beyond the five senses in your perception? Is that the way you're grading it, or some other way?
Yeah, well, one of the things that that we teach is that there's no such thing as extrasensory or extra senses. We only have the five senses. They're just not developed completely. So let's take the, sight, for instance. If you realize that the ultraviolet light is invisible to our physical sight, then just by thinking about it, by thinking about ultraviolet light and knowing that it's there, this is where faith comes in, where you know something is there, but you can't see it. And if you focus your attention on that, you could start to see, if you couldn't see the ultraviolet light itself, you might see what it illuminates. You see, it stretches your sensory bandwidth. And that's literally then would be making you more sensitive to higher rates of vibration. So we're talking in literal terms here. So we can hear at different octaves, all the way up to the point where then we can't hear anymore because the frequency range exceeds what the ears are capable of picking up. Because we don't really hear with the ears, we hear with the brain structure that interprets those inputs, those vibratory inputs in the ear itself. We hear in the brain. So by altering the brain, we increase the bandwidth of what we're able to detect. So, and this
is the mind or awareness a sense in your understanding? You said it's an extension. I think you said it was an extension. It's an extension of the five senses, but I'm wondering whether the brain or the consciousness are senses in your way of understanding. In other words, the mind knows whatever you want to call it, higher worlds, because I know you've referred to Steiner. The brain or the mind or consciousness, or is it really the five physical senses that we know extended?
Yeah, one of the symbols for man, meaning both men and women, but beyond gender, man means mind. And this in the Kybalion, we read that the universe is mental, and physicists now are discussing the possibility that consciousness is a fundamental fact of reality, that it's really it's fundamental to reality, that it's non-local. So the symbol for man is the pentagram, the five-pointed star. It's been used for a long time in that way. And what that refers to really are the five senses. Okay. So try to think of it in terms of like vision, that there's only one vision. Regardless of what it's seeing, there is only one universal faculty called sight. And the same with hearing. So, and some of the words we associate with vision or sight is being aware or conscious of it, of whatever is being looked at. And the same with hearing. Hearing can be associated with understanding. It's like I hear you, or I see where you're going with that, that kind of thing, or I have a feeling about, something. Okay. So these are really universal faculties that are independent of the body, independent of the brain, that the body, the brain, these are simply reflections, you might say.
Okay. All right. This helps me perhaps to understand why you use so much metaphor in your discourse.
I have been accused of that.
because you're referring what I would call abstract concepts to metaphors that connect with somehow with the five senses. I've noticed that.
Right. Well, in popular philosophy, the tendency is to go from concrete to abstract. And in science, that's reflected in the brain. It generates consciousness. It's not the receiving mechanism for consciousness. So it's a bottom-up philosophy.
Yeah.
But in reality, what I've experienced and what many others have experienced is that reality is top-down. It's like it begins in the abstract. And I think Plato talked about this, the idea of forms. And so just by going into abstract thought, we raise our vibration. Our mental vibration goes up just by, see my thumb? You do this and the thumb appears.
Okay, that's kind of what I started out to try to clarify when I started asking these questions.
Yes, right. And so in meditation, we get a sense that we are in that consciousness, our consciousness is within a vibratory range. And it's just, I think a lot of this started in the late 1800s when electrical theory first started emerging, and people were just, their minds were blown by it, just like AI is blowing our minds today. Back then, electromagnetism was like magic. It was like, oh my God, here's this reality, or this part of reality we can't touch, we can't see, but it's real, and look what it does. And so all the spiritual writers coming through that period started using electrical terminology as metaphors for the spiritual dialogue. So we have to recognize that there's that influence going on, but it really fits. It really fits because the same laws that govern electromagnetism seem to govern the laws of consciousness. They're the same. It's the same law manifesting on two different levels. So when we talk about, the aura or the atmosphere or the subtle bodies, we're talking, and we use electromagnetism metaphors for that, but there's a point at which a metaphor becomes reality. It's not a metaphor anymore. It's a description, because what we're picking up on is the same laws that govern light and energy govern consciousness. So this is how it ties together, and we begin to see how we're dealing with one thing and trying to use the same language for it.
Okay.
So in another thing too, that I like to say, that if you want to understand scripture, in either Christian scripture or Hindu scripture or any sacred mythology, it's better to rise up in consciousness first and then look, because those sacred scriptures were written by people who were in an elevated state of consciousness. So to approach what they're saying with a mundane consciousness is almost an impossibility. And it's what trips up theologians and philosophers the most, because they're trying to intellectualize something that exceeds the bounds of the intellect. So we have to rise up in consciousness, and there are various techniques, and yoga is all about that, right? Yoga is rising the kundalini up to the crown, and that's literally raising our consciousness and then we go into the crown chakra, is called the Saraswara, and as we enter into it, it's like an infinite field of consciousness. It becomes this like non-dual consciousness. We enter into that field, and it's very definitely a higher rate of vibration. So that's why it's so hard to interpret scripture, because it was written from there. So we can't approach it with, with the rational or even the emotional states of consciousness. We have to rise up in consciousness and then look, and then things start to make sense. It's kind of like people who've taken psychedelics, and they try to explain to people who haven't taken psychedelics. It's almost impossible. How can you describe that? It's like describing the color blue to a blind person. There's no reference there. So in answer to your question, Tom, yes, you have to rise up in consciousness in order to forgive. But just the will to forgive, the desire to forgive, or the desire to enter into a place where you can forgive, that in itself is raising your consciousness, raising the vibration of your consciousness, because you're seeing it from a greater perspective. And in terms of physics too, you take a volume of gas or even matter and you expand it. Say you expand matter, the molecules that compose that piece of matter are getting farther and farther apart. And so that's like rising up in consciousness as well. So when we go into the crown chakra and beyond, it's like we start to expand. This is where we get the terminology "expand your consciousness," because it's a greater perspective. And it's why mountains are symbols of exalted consciousness, because there are several things, and I'll go on with this in case it's helpful. But like with a mountain, when you're at the bottom of a mountain, all you can see is one face of it, and you're in a lower altitude, so your perspective is limited. But the higher up the mountain you go, the more your perspective broadens, until you get at the very top of the mountain, and it's almost like it's a breakthrough experience, right? Because until you're at the very summit of a pointed mountain, all you can see is what you can see. You can't see the other side of the mountain. But when you get to the top of the mountain, your perspective suddenly, quite dramatically and suddenly, becomes 360, and you can see everything. And so that's very, very much like the spiritual experience. You climb, you climb, you climb, you see more and more, but the difference between not being at the summit and being at the summit is dramatic. That's the enlightenment, what they're referring to as enlightenment. So you can see the analogy, how the law of analogy fits this so perfectly, because it's true on multiple levels. This is what the meaning of "as above, so below" means. It means something that is true on multiple levels. If it's true in the physical, it must be true in the spiritual. And it'll also be true in the mental and the emotional and the domain of will. All of those domains share that same metaphor, you might say. It fits on multiple levels. And that's how we, that gives us a real good indication whether something is true or not, if it's true on multiple levels. So every time we go up a level, we're literally raising the vibration of our consciousness. There's literally an increase. And someday I don't know about EEG, electroencephalograms, but how they measure that, but I do know very little about the different states, like the delta state and the theta state, those beta state. You know, so they're cluing in to these different, how vibration relates to consciousness. So
Supposedly those four states can be objectively measured on an EEG in terms of frequency of wave, actual wavelengths that they can measure on an EEG. I've heard.
Yes, but really what they're
Anyway.
measuring is just the function of the brain, how the brain is vibrating, right?
Okay. Yeah. All right.
So they're not measuring the reality of these higher realms. They're just measuring the reaction of the brain when it comes into contact with these higher vibrations.
Okay. Well, those higher vibrations might, in principle, be immeasurable.
Oh yeah, yeah, but they can be experienced.
So Michael, it sounds like you are finally putting science and spirituality together. They're not separate.
Yes, that's something that I'm predisposed to and have always been, and it's what drew me to the Holy Order of Mans, because Father Paul really had a handle on this, and he worked.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, he worked with chromotherapy too. You know, he worked with different light frequencies in terms of their healing effects on the physical body. So yeah, he was very much involved in that. Yeah.
Well, I just want to make sure I understand what you were saying about the forgiveness and the willingness. So we must rise up in consciousness in order to be able to forgive. But we have to be willing to forgive first. And that willingness, by entering into that state of willingness, we are in the process of raising our consciousness.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah, you can drag yourself kicking and screaming into a state of the ability to forgive. You know, it's like, okay, I forgive you, you son of a bitch. But I forgive you. God damn you.
Well, that whole concept, I'm reminded of, and you guys have been here before, you know that Renee and I talk a lot about AA and what's the little simple phrases in the recovery room. Well, the one phrase, act as if. Okay, well, today, I walk into the room, and yesterday I was at a state, or I'm even today, I don't think I cannot take a drink. I have to take a drink. I have to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hold on now. Act as if you don't have to.
Yeah, there you go.
Act as if.
Yeah.
So then I think it comes to belief. Man, I read a great quote in a book that Steve is very familiar with this week. There is the belief we believe, and then there is what we really believe.
Right.
Where did that come from, Tom?
That which you are seeking is causing you to seek
𝗪𝗂𝗶.
So what do I believe, act as if,
Yeah.
I remember hearing a guy say in a recovery room, he said, there are not enough AA meetings left in my life for me to be able to forgive my ex-wife.
That bitch, right?
That's right.
So the key word in all of this is act, and act as if, but the term act, that's like being an actor on a stage. You take on the role. We're not looking at it in terms so much of act as in do, we're looking at it as in taking on a role. So if you, and essentially what you're doing is you're telling a new story about yourself, to yourself. You're taking on the garment of attitudes. You're going through the motions of like speaking, and And as you take that on, then you become the character that you're portraying.
Michael,
Yeah.
and everybody, do you mind if I bring up a possible problem with this that I
Oh,
see?
sure. Sure.
Here in the States, you know, since I've traveled and lived in other countries now and have some other frames of reference to compare it to, I think that faking it is very, very widespread and rampant. Some version of it anyway, some version of faking it is like, you might even say, is the center of gravity of much of the social life in the middle class here in the United States. And is it working? I'll give you an example. I lived in Germany for almost 2 years during the pandemic. And the Germans generally, there's always exceptions, but the character, the national character, is not to fake it at all, and to be extremely direct and even unpleasant if the situation calls for it, and even sometimes when I think the situation doesn't call for it.
Mm-hmm.
The very opposite of what I find here.
Yeah, they say we're real nice, right? They say Americans are nice.
Yeah, overly so, and
yeah,
and I've
overly
and
so.
I've been alienated from the society, and I've been more German than I have been American, actually. The niceness and the fakeness comes across as very objectionable to them and to me. And
Yeah.
So for that reason, when you suggest faking it until you make it, the example I wanted to bring was, since I've been back the last 4 months, I hardly ever go on Facebook, but I went on Facebook. I started going on Facebook because 𝗃_𝘁 had a 7-day self-love challenge on a Facebook group. So I was on Facebook, and I changed my profile picture from one that was maybe slightly smiling to one that was more like this. And one of my so-called friends put a comment on the picture that just said, "Smile," and that set me off. And I just lit into her, and I said, "Do not do that to me ever again." And I meant it too. And it led to me making a post on 𝗃_𝘁's private group about this, and the post got about 50 likes on the Facebook group, contrary to my expectation. And it leads me to believe that there are a lot of there are a good many other people who feel the same way as I do. Do not come at me with put on a fake smile. I just will not tolerate it anymore.
That's great.
So I would like to comment on fake it till you make it.
Me too.
There is the sincerity to act.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not sincere, you will not make it. So Steve, you may be referring to a superficial or without a true desire to make it. Perhaps a person has that, if we want to relate it to recovery, I think that's the easiest place, where there's, just starting to think that I should do something, but I really don't want to just yet. Okay. The consciousness is starting to feel like there is something wrong, but I really don't want to. Well, I'm told fake it till I make it. All right, I'll fake it, but I really don't want to make it. It goes back to that quote of, there's what we believe, and then there's what we actually believe, or there's what we think or believe we want, and then there's actually what we want.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
So
there. Oh, go ahead, Renee.
As soon as the word faking came up for me, that's totally faking it until you make it is for me is totally different than act as if. If I'm acting, then there's something out there I want, maybe that I want to become. And so I'm aiming it all at me, at changing me on purpose. But faking it to me has more to do, in my opinion, with aiming. The whole reason to fake it is aiming it for others' perception, making me inauthentic.
Yeah.
You know, and Southerners are really good at this.
Tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me something I don't already know.
Well, I know that's what I'm saying, and I know how Southern you are. But you know, to me, they're totally different. Fake it till you make it is not act as if to me.
Acting as if is you're taking on a role like an actor would, but faking it is being deceptive.
Well, I think people could even fake it into a role, but it doesn't change them and doesn't become them. Acting as if I'm acting my way into a role that I want to become. And so my desire has a lot more to do with it. And ego for me with that would be left out, whereas faking it to me is more ego driven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, to me, this goes back to childhood and socialization.
Yep.
And Renee, Tom and Renee know me very well. I grew up in the country here in South Carolina in a subculture that didn't have much truck at all with faking it. It was more like the Germans than it was the mainstream American society. And that's the way I was raised, and that's the way I was formed. And it's like it seems like, and so I don't really know how middle class people in, let's say, in Columbia or in any city in the South were actually raised by their parents, but I can make some guesses, and I think it was like, this is how you have to be in this situation, and this is what you have to say, and this is what you have to do. And it was like teaching them a script for almost every situation, I think. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that teaches children to create a fake persona that they have to present. They have to present to other people. And it just, a lot of people never get beyond that. They never see through that. They never do anything except go through life with an inauthentic, fake persona and a fake smile on their face. And it just is so infuriating to me when I come in contact with it.
Yeah. So let me explore this a little bit. What you're describing, Steve, is like structure. What a society has those built-in rules, but they're not entirely just made up. They arise organically. So in other words, some of those rules will have to do with curbing impulsive behavior. Mm-hmm. Some of those rules will have to do with taking others' needs into consideration as well as your own. Mm-hmm. Some of the rules have to do with simply legalities. Don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't. These things are organic, but they have their particular expression through the culture culture is built on top of these organic rules. That's where that's where the 10 Commandments really come from. It's not like God reached down and wrote it into stone, like in a movie, but they really were Moses's realization of these are the ways we have learned over vast periods of time that make living together viable, right? This is how we get along. We don't murder, right? The word in the Hebrew word for kill actually means murder. So the commandment is do not murder. And murder is very different from killing someone in war and self-defense, those kinds of things. So they really arise up. They're the ground of that we stand on as human beings. This moral landscape. It's almost like it was there before we got here. So a lot of that cultural stuff is simply reinforcing that and figuring it out by living it, how to come into harmony with those organic ground up rules. So, but with it, and then on top of that, then we have the hero myth of where someone who breaks the rules for the sake of not being entombed by them. So we have mavericks, we always, mavericks are the hero. They're the ones who, the spirit of life is pushing against the boundaries of these rules, which can become quite oppressive and suffocating unless we go crazy. That's what Mardi Gras is about, is breaking all the categories, but not permanently. We don't live in a permanent Mardi Gras. We do it like for a brief season. And that's to explore a fuller range of our capabilities, of expression. So this is like the balance between order and chaos. Too much order is like the ultimate form of order is a grave where you're buried. That's completely orderly. And then the chaos then is like Mardi Gras. You see, so both have to be in a dynamic balance. So we can't just categorically condemn social constructs, because so often those constructs arise organically.
When I reflect on my upbringing, such as it was, which was very different, as I said, very different from mainstream American society, but I think it was typical of rural society for a long, long time, for many generations back. And the urban middle class is a Johnny come lately in a way to that to the bulk of the people, 90-something% who lived on farms and rural areas and probably grew up in much the same way I did. Now, it has its own problems. It has its own really serious problems. I'm not gonna deny that. But I asked a friend of mine some while back, an older friend of mine, she's like in her 80s now, who grew up here in rural South Carolina in a similar situation as I did. And I've studied some adult development and the fact that the majority of the people now look to other people for signals about what's normal and how they should behave, and they expect other people to do the same thing. And when I don't do that, I come into conflict with them. And I asked my friend, who was a retired professor, successful professor from the University of South Carolina, who got along, who reputedly was well liked and got along very well in the university for decades. I said, do you ever look to other people to figure out how you should be? She said, no, it never occurred to me to do that. Never in my life have I done that. And I said, what a relief to hear that, because virtually everybody, in quotation marks, if I ever get feedback, they tell me that it is required to do this and everybody does it. And why don't you do this? And it was like we were trained by the culture, like you're saying, it was organic in the culture. We weren't taught it. We just absorbed it. Decency and honesty and integrity and keeping your word and being decent and polite to people. We just absorbed it from the culture.
Yeah, yeah. The thing I've noticed about rural life is that it's you don't get to take days off. You know, if you're living on a farm and you're a family and in a community of other farms, I mean, the weather doesn't wait for anybody. Right. And so it can be brutal, and you have to manage livestock and slaughter livestock and you're up at the crack of doom and you work till late at night. So the requirements of rural life are so much greater physically and emotionally that it requires some pretty well-defined guardrails. You don't go outside of those guardrails. You don't suddenly decide to become an artist, for instance, because you're tied to the land. You see, so that's a very rigorous way of life. The city, on the other hand, is a much higher degree of cooperation and set up where people can actually find a little niche in that greater society and pretty much coast there without a lot of demands. But when you do engage fully in a urban setting, then the demands are entirely different than they are in a rural setting. And that's where it's like a greater degree of freedom. And so people then start going into, well, what if I was this way, or what if I was that way? So they don a costume that fits their fantasy and play that out. You see?
Yeah.
So
I never would have been able to fulfill myself if I had stayed there, but for sure.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, for people who need that, the constraint and a solid structure that kind of builds them from the ground up into it develops their character. It gives them backbone, because it gives you the ability to do what needs to be done without even the thought of complaining about it. This is something just has to be done, and the way you feel about it doesn't really have a lot to do with anything, because that community needs you to function without fail. You see?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. You said how you feel about it is irrelevant, and that explains a lot to me about my character and the way I am. Because the way the people were back there, feelings didn't count for anything.
Right.
That's part of the serious problems that I say exist back there. Serious problems from my certain point of view now.
Yeah.
But at that, as you explained, in that context, it wasn't a problem. It was actually a necessity to just put feelings away, and we don't deal with that, and because we got to survive, and this work has got to be done, and get up at 4:30 in the morning and go feed I remember my mother saying her father would say to her oldest brother, John L., get up and go feed the mules. And if he didn't get up in 5 minutes, he'd go in there and roll him out on the floor.
Yeah, right.
Right.
That's pretty tough training. That's like basic training. And what it fosters is loyalty, duty, loyalty in the sense that you are loyal to your fellow members, right, of that society. You have to behave in a way that supports the community. What we're looking at now, we live in 21st century America with a level of comfort and convenience that has never been seen before in the history of as far as we know. I mean, and what happens in a civilization like that is that people get focused on themselves and how they feel. So feelings become the most important thing. And then they base all of their activity, what they will do and what they won't do, based on how they feel about it. Yeah. And that's really a weakness. It's a profound weakness that if anything takes this society down, it will be that. And we're seeing, we are in the midst of that right now. It's like, if you say something that hurts my feelings, that's actually it's getting to where that's cause for legal action. And that's a serious problem. So we've taken the emphasis off of action and put it on feelings. But that said, we're in a transition phase where feelings are really, front and center, but we're not sure if that's not something that's needed, that we have to come, we're actually becoming more aware of our feelings. And what we're experiencing now with all this craziness is just exploring into that domain in excess, right? We're just taking it too far. We're finding out what's too far in order to come back to a reasonable middle.
That's a good that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like we can we can accuse people of being snowflakes or being too emotionally centered and all of that, but it'll make you crazy if you don't moderate that with a little bit of understanding, a little bit of heart that says we're moving into a new area of consciousness that we've neglected by force. We've been forced to neglect it because feelings have no place in a rural or more fun, more basic way of living. You have to do certain things. Now we're in a position where a lot of us don't have to do much of anything, relatively speaking. And so we just have to kind of give it a little bit of room, but not too much room.
That's very this discussion is very helpful to me. I don't know if it is to anybody else, but maybe I dominated the conversation too much, but it's I hope it's helpful to other people.
I think it's seminal. I think this is what society is going through, and you've nailed it.
It really, I'd like to talk about this more at some point in some context, because it's really on my mind right now. My personal relationship to feeling, and what you said and the discussion helped to clarify some things to me about how I grew up and why I have the relationship to feeling that I have, which is so different from most of the people that I know now. And I think most of them consider my configuration to be abnormal. And I get that feedback. And I've just come, just in the last day or two, I've come to the conclusion I'm not gonna accept that. I'm not gonna accept that it means that there's something wrong with me.
Right. Yeah. You have just a different perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
What-
there are advantages to it as well as disadvantages, just like there are with anything, but it had to be this way. And giving myself a hard time and feeling bad about myself because there's supposedly some kind of deficit in my development isn't really beneficial to me to view it that way.
Yeah. So we're looking at something here that has its origins in a spiritual evolution. In other words, as we develop our intellectual capacity and our ability to think abstractly and to venture into different realms of consciousness, it's awakening different parts of us. And one of the things that's awakening is the heart. The heart is starting to open, and you hear it in terms of, well, the feminine is on the rise, like we're moving into a new consciousness that is more feminine in nature. That we can't do anything about that because we have set the stage, and plus there are cosmological forces in a spiritual context that are opening us up. And as the heart opens, then that's throwing us into new territory. I think the feminine, as it manifests in humans as women, I think they've been ahead of that curve for quite some time because they have to be. The needs of the infant are immediate and mandatory. You cannot argue or reason with an infant. Its needs must be attended to immediately. And so women biologically are almost like wired for two. You know, they're neurologically, they are not one person, they are two. So that's very different from the male body, which has to be more singular, more individual, because it's the point of the spear, right? Dealing with the outer world primarily, whereas the female has to be very concerned with the protective home and the attending to the needs of infants. So that's the biological landscape that we're having to deal with.
So a lot of times, it seems like it's mostly women who find my mood to be objectionable and abnormal.
Yeah.
And generally find this to be true with a lot of men. A lot of men have this configuration, and it's become almost a pejorative thing in the culture. And I think that there's something off about that, I think.
Right. Well, the answer is always in the balance. You know, like with you, it would be good to really delve into the fine arts and to like that experience I had with the painting of Jesus. It's not like it was he looked more like a medieval person, than what you normally see Jesus portrayed as. So he was more human than divine, is what I'm trying to get at. And trying to figure out how this person that was in the picture, how they were feeling, that helps develop your heart, because it's empathy. In order to do that, you have to empathize with the person and pick up subtle cues from their facial expression and their body language, and then map your own feelings onto that and see how that picture makes you feel. And that automatically starts opening up the heart, gives you a greater sense of empathy, and that takes you into an entirely new domain.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's great, and it sounds probably objectively necessary for that movement to take place, Michael. It's that I think it's right here in my experience the last couple of days, this issue, that in order to move more into that, it's got to become for me not like an order or a requirement from on high, or even a social pressure to do it. It's got to come voluntarily and organically, but I'm feeling pushed and coerced into it for some reason. And
oh yeah, yeah, there's enormous social pressures right now to do this. So I think for you, Steve, it would be, and you seem to have a sense of this, it would be to focus on beauty. That's your way out.
how do you mean?
Just really appreciating the beautiful and looking for the beautiful, taking any situation or any object and just focusing on what's beautiful about it. Because beauty and our sense of beauty is heart-centered. It's not abstract. It's not intellectual. It's not. It's totally heart. So by appreciating the beautiful, that opens up the heart, and then that expands your consciousness in ways that helps you to be more patient with people who are so encased in this new direction that they can't see anything else. That could help you be a little more patient with them. Doesn't mean you have to do what they say to do, but it gives you just a little bit more empathy towards what they're going through.
All right. And do you and are you using the term heart to mean sentiment and feeling, or are you using it more in the traditional sense of a core spiritual faculty?
Yeah, well, there are links between the two. Again, as above, so below. So the physical heart in your chest has, through the law of analogy, there are actual physiological structures in the heart. Like I think they talk about the connection between women and a mother and their child, and it's related to the thymus gland, which is like in this area close to the heart. And so there's a literal physiological connection between mother and child that lasts for a given number of years. And as that connection weakens, as the child becomes more and more of an adult, the thymus gland actually shrinks. So there are lots of occult physiological or occult anatomy factors that play into this. So when we talk about the heart, it's several dimensions all in one area, right? But usually when we say heart, it's the ability, the capacity to feel what someone else is feeling. It's the capacity to connect with the beautiful and to recognize the beautiful and to experience ecstasy in the beautiful. So beauty and heart are like, they're almost synonymous.
So if you, Michael, okay, your example of beauty, say two people were standing in front of a landscape.
Yeah.
Sun is setting. No matter what our backgrounds, we stand there and we go, whoa, both of us.
Yep. Yep.
We both know what we mean.
Yep. So there's a great movie that illustrates this to a T, and it stars Josh Brolin and forget the other actors. Oh, Jennifer Connelly is in it too, and he plays the Granite Mountain firefighting group down in Arizona or New Mexico, one of those places. Hot Shots. Yeah, I think that, and it was about a crew of wildfire fighters that died, 12, 13 men. It's a terrible tragedy. But in his job, this Josh Brolin character as the leader, his job is to change in one part of their training, their early training, his job is to change their perspective. He needs them to see the landscape differently. So he takes them up on a mountain, and all of this beautiful forest land is out in front of them. And he says to them, you're at the beginning of your training, and this beautiful landscape that you're seeing, this is the last time you'll ever see it. Because when you're done with your training, you will no longer see a beautiful forest. All you will see is fuel. You see? Doesn't that illustrate what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, viewing, in the farming community, it was really almost exclusively utilitarian. Like
that's the word. That's the word, utilitarian. Right.
We gotta get things done, and
well, you got a cut on your finger.
All this beauty, all this beauty crap. I'm speaking extremely now. Nobody, virtually nobody ever said this, but all this beauty stuff be damned, because I don't have time for that. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now what's happening in the spiritual evolution of the race is that we have to take time for that. Otherwise, we become, we start to experience these intense feelings of inner conflict, because the heart wants and needs to be able to express and to receive and perceive. And if we try to squelch that, then we have real problems, psychologically, emotionally, socially, in every which way.
I can absolutely see the truth of what you're saying. The balance has to be in everything. I see it. It's a little bit of a hard road for me right now, when I feel like I'm being forced and coerced into it, though. I've got to find a way to neutralize that.
Yep. Just consider, let's go back to like the 10th, 12th, 11th, 12th centuries, when life was very difficult, and most of it was rural and had all of the demands that it was just really hard living. So what did the spiritual leaders of the day do? They built these cathedrals. They built these cathedrals.
Yeah.
And even today, we walk into a cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame, and it just blows your mind. I mean, it's like, oh my God. Mm-hmm. These stained glass and these expansive interior spaces, all geometrically, refined. I mean, that was like forced therapy to almost grabbing people by the nape of the neck and pulling them up in consciousness, to say, I know you live in a mud hut out there in the rural lands, and you're in cow shit all day long. Well, come in here. Let me show you this.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that must have been like for common people?
No,
that would
not really.
Mind blowing. That would be like an acid trip.
Yeah.
In real life.
I'll never forget a friend of mine who was an art teacher, lived on Johns Island, and she taught at Johns Island High School, which was at that point in time very, very rural. And for a field trip, she took her students to Charleston Place, or the Omni, and there was a huge chandelier right in the middle of where all of the hallways come together, in the downstairs and the common area. And she went with a couple of kids to the bathroom, and everybody else was to stay there. And she came back, and all of the kids were lying on the floor looking up into this chandelier, because it was so incredible, and it was something that they'd never experienced.
Yeah.
And they were awestruck.
Yeah. That's a tool for transcendence.
Mm-hmm. Well, so is literature to me. I mean, I remember taking, I took one business course. No offense to y'all who are in business, but I took one business course and I'm like, oh no, this doesn't feel good. The content is not me. You know, it's where I could go and make money, but the content is not me. And the way that these people react with each other, you know, kind of faking it because that's how you climb the ladder.
Right.
So I realized that that was not for me. And, you know, of course, then I went into computer science and I went into this and I went into that. Finally, I ended up, you know, in teaching. And actually, when I was in graduate school, wasn't even sure that I wanted to be a teacher until literally an assistantship fell into my lap and I was forced, I decided to take it. And my job was to work with the students who were the presidential admits. The president of the university gets to choose 100 students who don't qualify to come in. And probably 80 to 90% of them were athletes. So I was assigned, you know, I was given my charges and worked with them. And it was an incredible experience seeing these and right then and there. I mean, I'll never forget working with one of them who was a student from a rural town, from 𝗹𝗴𝘁𝗆, South Carolina. And I mean, I remember working with him and the light bulb, watching the light bulb go off. And I knew this is my calling.
Sure.
And then literature became a way to bring kids into higher thinking, into, you know, becoming, having more empathy. In fact, awestruck. Yeah. In fact, even today, 6, 7 years after retirement, I really miss teaching my 7th grade students A Christmas Carol. Because every year when I taught it, I got choked up because of the transformation watching this character go through. And the kids, you know, now some of them, you know, didn't quite get it, but you know, watching them watch this character change. And and it's funny too, after having gone through, you know, a couple of times the 12 steps in AA, I have a hard time dealing with people and relating to people who are on a lower level of consciousness.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's very difficult. You know, and even Andrew said when we were working with him, you're going to find that, you know, you're not going to have any friends. You know,
it's okay with me.
Yeah. Well, you know, the feminine way of teaching is very much like you just described. It's setting it up and exposing, and it's like tending a garden. You know, you wait for the bloom. The masculine approach to education is more setting standards and then encouraging and demanding that those standards be met. You know, like as in ideas and behaviors and things like that. So both are essential. Both are absolutely necessary, and they're necessary at different stages. But the best teacher is one who has a little bit of both, or a lot of both, to where, you know, you can plan a curriculum that will lead a person into their own realization, which is really optimal. But because once a person comes into it on their own, they own it. They think that really they figured it out, and so they own it, and then they will resist you trying to take it away from them, or anybody else trying to take it away from them. But on the masculine side, it's more like there's a mountain, we're going to climb it, get your gear together, we're going, you know, that kind of thing. And it doesn't matter how you feel about it, you know, we're going to do this. is action oriented. So just understanding that polarity, that spectrum, you know, then and really being true to both of them, really honoring both of them in their purity, that gives you the freedom then to explore the spectrum and to apply one at one time and the other at another time according to the need of the student. So these are crucial elements to understand in terms of education and training, these kinds of things. Just knowing that there's a polarity there.
Temperance.
Yeah, temperance, right? Yeah, and temperance is, it's not static. See, that's the thing that people get off on, is like, oh, we need balance. You know, we have to be just as masculine as we are feminine, and vice versa. And what is that? That's not realistic, because the situation is never all one or the other. The situation is always, mediated
by the heart.
Yep, you've got to have that fulcrum going on. It's like skiing, you know. You're never always skiing on your right ski, you know.
You were talking about octaves earlier, and I think we everything connects back to this. Everything that we're discussing is part of this bigger picture. Ultimately, we're talking about mediating, talking about the heart, we're talking about temperance, and using both pure energies in their pure form. And if you think about of the octave, you know, symbolized by that 8, you know, the 8 has that mediating center to it, where the two opposing energies have to cross over, and that tends to be, you know, if that is what an octave is, it has to have this point of interpretation from above and below, where there's this communication happening, but there's still a separation. There's still a different
quality. Yeah.
Quality. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we're talking about what's measurable, but then there's a point of interpretation where we cross over from what's measurable and what's apparent to what is not seen, not measurable, but it's still, we can still experience it in a different way.
Right.
And
well,
so
you know,
all
like
these
with
things fit together.
Yeah, with middle C on the piano keyboard, when you hit it, all the other C notes or strings within the piano board, they all vibrate in resonance with that one octave. So
That's
there's
pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and you've seen like those demonstrations with tuning forks, where you hit a tuning fork and then the other same kind of tuning fork, same note, they all start to vibrate. But one that's not, you know, so you have a C and an F, the F doesn't do anything. It has to be vibrationally. Cool. Yeah.
Well, Stephen was talking about the imposition of external dictates and this, how things are forced upon, and I think that's an inherent quality of the lower nature of that figure 8, if you will, where it's the effects of higher order, like, you know, higher cause. And I think at some point we all face this we confront this at some point where we've internalized the essence of these external impositions, and we want to express in something new into the world. We no longer want to just repeat something it's essentially old structures, and it's like a renewing, right? So I think that's a natural regenerative desire that at some point we want to express. And when you said focus on beauty, it's like, that's perfect, because that is where the heart is. That is where the heart expresses from, and that's where we really see from. And so that's just a very simple way to like fix our attention on really the heart of the matter. I'm not trying to use a pun
Yeah.
here, but
Yeah. Well, look at how this is being scaled now. Technology is making everyone a photographer. Everyone carries a very high quality camera in their pocket all the time, and people are always trying to capture something beautiful. So that impulse is being freed up across a wide base of the population. I mean, everybody has that possibility now. So that's going to have an effect on the overall spiritual evolution of the human race, because technology is making it possible. But actually, in reality, it's because we're opening up, the heart is opening up, that camera exists. That camera was invented because of the need. The reality, the camera is not causing anything. The camera is a result of the opening heart in humanity as a whole.
It's an expression.
It's an expression, right? It's like the internet didn't come into existence and then cause all of this interconnectedness. No, we inwardly, psychically, we're expanding consciousness, and so the internet just is mirroring what's happening on the spiritual level. That's where reality is upside down and backwards to what appears. So just to touch on this thing about faking it until you make it, in this, we categorize 3 stages in spiritual growth. One is assumption, one is comprehension, and then realization. So assumption is where we assume a role, just like an actor does in a play. You take on the role. You've heard how actors will study their character and invent a backstory, stuff that they will never use, but they go into the childhood of the character and the different relationships they had, and what those relationships did to form their character. This is what real actors do. They really understand their character, and they will practice being that person in their everyday life just to get to know that character. So that's assuming a role, and you have to do that. If your heart's desire is to be on the spiritual path, you kind of have to assume the role of a spiritual aspirant. You have to consider yourself like a New Age monk or something, and the way you do that then is you normally start accumulating sacred objects and books that are elevated nature, and you display your books. You maybe make up a little shrine, or you have a special corner where you assume it. You take that on, you construct it. You're in terms of what we're talking about, you fake it until you start to get a feeling for it. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a necessary stage. But as you do that, then you start to experience it. You start to make the connection. You're already opening up in the heart, but then when you produce on the outside these props and activities that fit an idea of it, then you start to make the connections. Oh, this is real. If I set up an altar in my house and put a nice clean cloth on it and a beautiful candle and a picture, that you begin to, that's kind of faking it until you make it. That's assuming the role of a spiritual aspirant. But then all of a sudden it clicks, like, oh my God, this is a focal point of spiritual power. I'm creating it, but I'm not creating it. I'm opening a door so that reality can then manifest on the physical plane. So then you begin to comprehend what you're assuming. So you've got the feeling and the assuming, and then you get the mental, which is the comprehension, and then those two come together and you become it. Then you're not faking anymore. You've actually transformed into a spiritual aspirant, and that changes everything.
So that's
So-
like the external imposition of, it's almost like a dictate, but you're dictating it to yourself. Like you're telling yourself to act this
Yeah.
way and do this thing, which we tend to rebel against when it's some other person's idea, right? But
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
but we're writing our own script there. Is
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah, and we write our own script, and we can borrow from other scripts, which we always do. I mean, nobody comes up
Mhm.
with this stuff on their own entirely. I just saw a subtitle for a book. In the subtitle was "Freedom Through Structure." So when we have like for instance, when I learned how to ski, it was grueling, it was horrible, it was wet, it was cold, it hurt, everything was awful about it, for a 10-year-old kid. But then the more I did the drill and learned how to turn my skis and to go faster and do different things, once I had that structure, then the mountain opened up. It's like there wasn't anything I couldn't do. But without that structure, I would never have experienced that level of freedom. So some people are putting it like, in order to be free, you must first be a slave. You have to give yourself over to a discipline. And then once you have that discipline, man, then you can do way more than you could without the discipline.
Yeah. And you can build on it.
You can build on it. Yeah. You got your basic toolbox,
Or
Like-
reinvent it completely if you want.
Oh yeah. 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 It's like, I love that quote by Charlie Parker, the Byrd saxophone player, and who I'm not into jazz that much, but I can appreciate the talent and the extraordinary artistry of it. Somebody and evidently Parker was just transcendent in the way he played the saxophone. And somebody asked him, "How do you do that?" And he said, "First you learn your instrument real good, and then you forget all that shit and wail." That's
Nice.
mastery, right? But you don't get to mastery without first being a slave.
Mhm.
You don't become a journeyman without first being an apprentice. And and then there's that other movie, $1 Million Baby, with Clint Eastwood and Hilary Swank. And she's a boxer, but she's got every bad habit there is. And so her trainer waxes on about it and says, you have to, God, how did he put it? I'm going to watch it again to get it just right. But he said something like, you got to beat that crap out of them. All those bad habits, you pretty much have to, well, he tied a rope around her ankles, so she couldn't overstep, she had to stay over her center of gravity more. And also would do things like strap her right hand to her chest so she couldn't, she had to learn how to jab, only. That's brutal, but that breaks your habit. And he's in regards to bad habits, he said, you have to make them forget it in their bones. And I thought, oh my God, that's so much like spiritual training. In my own training, I mean, we had to get up and go to communion in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, whether we wanted to or not. It's like living on the farm. We were living on a spiritual farm. This is what you're going to do. And if you don't do it, you're out. There's the door. You don't like the program? There's the door.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of brutal. And I think it was Max Weber who said that that kind of transformation has the quality of violence to it. Because
remember the quotation from the other day? The kingdom
No.
of heaven is
Oh.
suffering violence, and the violent are taking it by force.
Oh yeah.
By discipline. They're doing it by strict discipline.
Right. They're forcing it. They're not letting go. They're not allowing the transformation to occur in its own time frame. They're trying to make it happen. Yeah. Yeah.
I've learned I've taken that to an extreme, and to the point where it sort of destroyed itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a subtle point. You know, because there's also the other occult saying that power never surrenders itself, it must be seized. So nobody's going to give you your spiritual attainment. You actually do have to work for it. But you work and work and work, and then it happens. All you're doing, it always happens by accident. When, you know, it's like when Jesus said, it's like a thief coming in the night. You don't know when they're coming, you know, that's the whole point. But so what we do with spiritual work and spiritual discipline is we just simply make ourselves more accident prone. But when that breakthrough actually happens, we don't know. We can't force that. We can force the discipline, but we can't force the actual boom. You know?
Is that through receptivity? Is that the way you become more accident prone?
Well, somebody else said that, how does it go? It's like with enough preparation, you get lucky. Without the preparation, you're not going to get lucky.
So it's a combination of both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Active and, yeah.
The preparation is grueling. The preparation requires a lot of work and a lot of discipline, but the actual occurrence of God realization, you can't make that happen.
So it's again back to temperance.
Yeah. You're screwed either way, but you know, in a good way.
I have to run, but
all right.
I really appreciate the conversation, guys.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, we just noticed our yard guy is here, so we need to go see him.
Yeah, we're way over time. We're pushing 2 hours here, so.
That's all right. This has been great. Thanks. Thanks,
You
everybody.
bet. You bet.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care, Steve.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye. Bye.